The small town streets were quiet that day, the kind of stillness that made every sound echo and linger. Officer James Harper, a seasoned cop with a strong jawline and a sense of authority etched into his demeanor, patrolled his usual route. Known for his strictness, James had developed a reputation in the town, not all of it positive. He was firm, confident, and at times dismissive of the people he didn't understand. As he drove his patrol car through the streets, something caught his attention, a man walking briskly down the sidewalk in a crisp, tailored suit. He was tall, confident, and carried himself with a sense of purpose. The man, whose name was Marcus Bennett, didn't seem to belong in this part of town, at least not in James's eyes. James slowed his car, his suspicion immediately piqued. The man wasn't doing anything wrong, but James's instincts, or perhaps his biases, kicked in. He rolled down his window and called out. "Excuse me, sir," James barked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Marcus stopped in his tracks, turning to face the officer. His face remained calm, but his eyes showed a hint of frustration. He had experienced encounters like this before. "Yes, officer," Marcus replied, his voice steady but guarded. James parked his car and stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity? I was just walking to my meeting. Is that a crime now?" James's eyes narrowed. The man's calm demeanor irritated him. It felt too confident, almost defiant. "ID, please," James demanded, ignoring Marcus's question. Marcus sighed, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license without a word, his expression betraying only a flicker of annoyance. James scrutinized the ID, searching for something, anything, that would validate his suspicions, but everything checked out. Still, he wasn't satisfied. "What's in the briefcase?" James asked, nodding toward the leather bag Marcus was carrying. Marcus glanced at the briefcase, then back at James. "It's work documents," he said simply. James didn't budge. "Open it." Marcus hesitated, his frustration mounting. "Is that really necessary? I've already given you my ID, and I haven't done anything wrong." James's tone hardened. "If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind showing me." The tension in the air thickened as Marcus slowly set the briefcase on the ground and opened it. Inside were neatly organized files, a laptop, and a few pens, nothing remotely suspicious. Marcus straightened up, his patience wearing thin. "Are we done here, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice edged with irritation. James crossed his arms, still not satisfied. "Where are you coming from and where are you headed?" Marcus took a deep breath, clearly trying to remain composed. "I just got off a train. I'm walking to a meeting downtown, that's all." The mention of the train seemed to light a spark in James's mind. "Let me guess. You're not from around here, are you?" Marcus shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, I'm not. Is that a problem?" James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his radio, calling in Marcus's information. It was a routine check, but the act itself was enough to escalate the encounter. Marcus folded his arms, his frustration now evident. A few passers-by had stopped to watch, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, and it only deepened the knot in his stomach. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. Minutes felt like hours as James waited for the radio response. When it finally came back, it confirmed what Marcus had already told him. There was no record, no cause for suspicion, but instead of admitting he was wrong, James doubled down. "I'm going to need you to come with me," James said, stepping closer. "We'll sort this out at the station." Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you serious? On what grounds?" James's tone left no room for argument. "Suspicious behavior." Marcus stared at the officer, his chest tightening with anger and disbelief. He had heard those words before, words that had been used to justify countless injustices against people who looked like him. But this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. "Fine," Marcus said coldly. "Let's go." As James led Marcus toward the patrol car, the onlookers whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads, while others pulled out their phones to record. Marcus climbed into the back seat, his mind racing. He had a feeling this was far from over, and he was right. What awaited them at the station would turn this encounter into something James would never forget. The ride to the station was steeped in silence, save for the low hum of the patrol car's engine. James Harper sat in the driver's seat, his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. In the back seat, Marcus Bennett remained composed, though his mind churned with frustration. He had been through situations like this before, but it never got easier. The station came into view, a modest building with a few squad cars parked outside. James pulled into the lot, parked, and stepped out without a word. Opening the back door, he gestured for Marcus to step out. "Let's go," James said curtly. Marcus complied, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. He followed James inside, where the atmosphere shifted. Officers milled about, some laughing over coffee, others buried in paperwork. Conversations quieted as Marcus and James entered. A few officers glanced up, their brows furrowing at the sight of Marcus in a suit being led into the station. James brought Marcus to the front desk, where a younger officer, Sarah, was stationed. She looked up, her cheerful demeanor faltering when she saw the scene before her. "Officer Harper," she said hesitantly. "What's going on?" "Suspicious behavior," James replied briskly. "I need him processed." Sarah's eyes flickered to Marcus, then back to James. Something in her gaze softened as she noticed Marcus's calm posture and the sharp contrast between his demeanor and James's firm, almost defensive stance. "Do you have probable cause?" she asked, her voice cautious but firm. James frowned. "Just process him, Sarah." Before Sarah could respond, a voice rang out from the back of the room. It was deep, commanding, and instantly drew the attention of everyone in the station. "What's going on here?" All eyes turned to the doorway as a man in his mid-50s entered. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and wore a badge that marked him as the station's captain. Captain Douglas was known for his no-nonsense attitude and his commitment to fairness. "Captain," James said, straightening up, "this man was acting suspiciously in town. I thought it best to bring him in." Captain Douglas's sharp eyes shifted to Marcus, who met his gaze evenly. There was no fear in Marcus's expression, only calm resolve. "Your name, sir?" Douglas asked. "Marcus Bennett," he replied. "I was on my way to a meeting when Officer Harper decided my walk was suspicious." Douglas frowned, turning back to James. "Did he resist? Was there any indication of illegal activity?" James hesitated. "No, but nothing," Douglas interrupted, his tone cutting. "Do we have any grounds to hold him?" James opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, Marcus reached into his pocket. The movement drew the room's attention, but Marcus moved slowly, deliberately. From his pocket he pulled a sleek business card and handed it to Captain Douglas. Douglas took the card, his eyes scanning the text. As he read, his expression shifted, from curiosity to surprise, then to something close to disbelief. He looked up at Marcus, his gaze sharp. "You're Marcus Bennett," Douglas said slowly, his voice carrying a mix of recognition and respect. Marcus nodded. "That's correct." The room fell silent as Douglas turned the card around for James to see. The words printed in bold letters sent a chill down James's spine. James's face paled as the realization hit him like a freight train. He had just detained a man who held significant authority over the justice system. A man who could, with a single phone call, put James's entire career under scrutiny. "You're the prosecutor assigned to the district reforms," Douglas said, his tone now carrying a hint of apology. "That's right," Marcus replied calmly. "And today was supposed to be my first meeting with local officials. Instead, I've been brought here under false pretenses." The tension in the room was palpable. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, and James looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Captain Douglas cleared his throat, his face stern. "Officer Harper," Douglas said, his voice cold. "You've made a serious mistake." James stammered, searching for words. I didn't know who he was." "And that's the problem," Marcus interjected, his voice firm but measured. "It shouldn't matter who I am. I was treated like a suspect for no reason other than walking down the street. How many others have you treated the same way?" The room was silent, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on everyone present. Captain Douglas nodded, his expression grim. "Mr. Bennett, I deeply apologize for this," Douglas said sincerely. "Rest assured, this will be dealt with." Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "I hope so, Captain. Because this isn't just about me. It's about the system you represent." Douglas nodded again, turning to James. "Harper, my office. Now." James hesitated, then walked away, his shoulders slumped. The station buzzed with whispers as Marcus turned to leave. Captain Douglas's office was small and sparsely decorated, but the tension inside was anything but minimal. James Harper stood rigidly by the door, his hands clasped behind his back as if bracing himself for a storm. Captain Douglas leaned against his desk, arms crossed, his face a portrait of barely contained anger. "What the hell were you thinking, Harper?" Douglas's voice was low but carried a weight that made James flinch. I thought he was acting suspicious," James stammered. "He was just standing around, looking at buildings." "Looking at buildings?" Douglas interrupted, his tone dripping with disbelief. "That's the best you've got? A man in a suit walking through town is suspicious?" James opened his mouth to respond, but Douglas held up a hand to stop him. "Number, don't. I've heard enough." Douglas turned and paced the room, his frustration palpable. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? You didn't just detain a random citizen. You detained one of the most respected federal prosecutors in the country. A man who, by the way, has been sent here to oversee reforms in the justice system. And you've just handed him a perfect example of everything wrong with it." James swallowed hard. "I didn't know." "You didn't know," Douglas repeated, his voice rising. "And that's the problem, Harper. You didn't know and you didn't care. You saw a black man and you assumed the worst. Don't even try to deny it." James felt the sting of those words, but he couldn't argue. Deep down, he knew Douglas was right. He had acted on impulse, on ingrained biases he hadn't even realized he carried. Douglas sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Harper, this department has been under scrutiny for years. We've been trying to rebuild trust with this community, to show them that we're better than the stereotypes. And then you go and pull this stunt. Do you have any idea how much damage you've just done?" James looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Douglas's eyes narrowed. "Intent doesn't matter, Harper. Impact does. And the impact of your actions today could ripple far beyond this department." As James faced his reckoning, Marcus Bennett was on a call with his assistant, recounting the events of the day. He sat in a quiet coffee shop across the street from the precinct, his calm exterior masking the turmoil he felt inside. "They detained you?" his assistant Karen exclaimed, her voice sharp with outrage. "On your first day in town?" "Yes," Marcus replied evenly, "and it's not the first time something like this has happened. But it might be the most significant." Karen's voice softened. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Marcus assured her. "But this isn't just about me. This is about a culture that allows assumptions like Officer Harper's to dictate actions. And that culture needs to change. Karen hesitated. What are you going to do? Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the precinct across the street. I'm going to do exactly what I was sent here to do. Hold people accountable and make sure this system serves everyone equally. Word of the incident had spread through the precinct like wildfire. Officers whispered in corners, exchanging nervous glances. Some defended James, citing his otherwise clean record, while others shook their heads, recognizing the deeper implications of his actions. Captain Douglas called an emergency meeting, gathering the entire department in the briefing room. The air was thick with unease as officers filed in, taking their seats. James sat near the back, his face pale and his jaw clenched. Douglas stood at the front, his presence commanding. I've called this meeting because something happened today that we all need to address. Officer Harper detained a man without probable cause, acting on nothing more than an assumption. Murmurs rippled through the room, but Douglas silenced them with a sharp glare. The man he detained was Marcus Bennett, a federal prosecutor sent here to oversee justice reforms. And while that fact alone is damning, the truth is, it shouldn't matter who he is. What matters is that Harper's actions reflect a bias that has no place in this department. Douglas's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of every officer. This is a wake-up call. If we're going to rebuild trust with this community, we need to start by confronting the biases we carry, whether we realize we have them or not. James felt the weight of those words like a punch to the gut. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant any harm, but he knew it wouldn't change the truth. Douglas continued, his voice firm. Effective immediately, Officer Harper is placed on administrative leave pending a full review of his actions. And moving forward, every officer in this department will undergo mandatory bias training, no exceptions. The room fell silent, the gravity of Douglas's words sinking in. For James, it was a moment of reckoning. For Marcus, watching from across the street, it was a small but significant step toward justice. As the department reeled from Captain Douglas's firm response, Marcus Bennett prepared for the next step in his mission. Sitting in a conference room at City Hall, Marcus reviewed the precinct's internal records. Stacks of files and his laptop were spread across the table, each document painting a picture of patterns, trends, and inequities. Karen entered the room with a fresh pot of coffee. I pulled the arrest stats you asked for, she said, placing a folder in front of him. You were right. The numbers are troubling. Marcus flipped through the folder, his sharp eyes scanning the data. It confirmed what he already suspected. Black residents in the city were disproportionately stopped, questioned, and arrested compared to their white counterparts, often for minor infractions or no reason at all. The numbers were damning, and they underscored the urgency of his work. Thanks, Karen, Marcus said, setting the folder aside. It's one thing to know this is happening. It's another to see it in black and white. Karen hesitated. Do you think they'll listen? The department, I mean. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I don't know. Change is never easy, especially when it threatens the status quo. But I didn't come here to be ignored. I came here to hold people accountable. James sat in his small apartment, staring at the television, but he wasn't watching it. His mind was consumed by the events of the past 24 hours. The look on Captain Douglas's face, the murmurs of his colleagues in the briefing room, and, most of all, the calm, composed expression of Marcus Bennett as he stood outside the precinct. It all haunted him. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. He picked it up reluctantly, seeing a message from his partner, Officer Collins. You good? This whole thing is crazy. James stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Finally, he typed back, Not really. I messed up. Big time. Collins responded almost immediately. You're not the first to mess up. They'll let this blow over. James frowned. He knew Collins meant well, but the idea of just waiting for this to blow over didn't sit right with him. For the first time in years, James felt the weight of his badge, what it represented, and how he had failed to uphold its meaning. 2 days later, Marcus walked into the precinct, his presence commanding but not overbearing. He had been invited by Captain Douglas to address the officers directly, a rare opportunity and a calculated risk. The briefing room was packed. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to expect. James sat near the back, his face drawn but attentive. Marcus stood at the front of the room, his posture confident but approachable. "Good morning," Marcus began, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marcus Bennett. I'm a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights cases, and I've been tasked with overseeing justice reforms in this city." He paused, letting his words settle. "I know my presence here has caused some discomfort. I know some of you feel targeted or defensive. That's not my goal. I'm not here to tear anyone down. I'm here to help us build something better." The room was silent, the officers listening intently. Marcus's tone was firm but empathetic, his words carefully chosen. "I've reviewed the data," he continued, "and the numbers don't lie. There's a problem in this department, a problem that isn't unique to this city, but is deeply entrenched in law enforcement across the country. It's a problem of bias, of assumptions, of actions that stem from those assumptions." He glanced around the room, his gaze landing briefly on James before moving on. "The incident that brought me here wasn't just about me. It was about a culture that allows good people to make bad decisions because they've never been taught to question their biases." James felt a lump form in his throat. Marcus's words struck a nerve, forcing him to confront his actions and their consequences in a way he hadn't before. Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "But here's the thing. Change is possible. It starts with acknowledging the problem, with having difficult conversations, and with holding ourselves accountable. It's not easy, but it's necessary." He stepped back from the podium, his expression softening. "I don't expect this to happen overnight, but I do expect commitment. Commitment to listening, to learning, and to doing better, for each other, for this community, and for the badge you wear." The room was silent as Marcus finished. Captain Douglas stepped forward, nodding in agreement. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Officers, let's use this as an opportunity to grow. The people we serve deserve nothing less." As the meeting ended and officers filed out, James hesitated. He lingered near the back of the room, his mind racing. Finally, he approached Marcus, who was gathering his notes at the podium. "Mr. Bennett," James said quietly. Marcus looked up, his expression neutral but attentive. "Officer Harper." James swallowed hard. "I wanted to apologize for what I did. It was wrong, and I realize now that I have a lot to learn." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Acknowledging it is a start. But an apology alone doesn't change anything. What you do next is what matters." "I know," James said, his voice earnest. "I want to do better." Marcus extended a hand. "Then let's start there." James shook his hand, feeling a mix of relief and determination. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a challenge, and he was ready to rise to it. The weeks that followed were anything but easy. For James Harper, every shift felt like a test of his commitment to change. The department had implemented mandatory training sessions on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation tactics. At first, the sessions were met with resistance, muttered complaints, skeptical glances, and outright dismissal from some officers. But for James, they became a mirror, forcing him to confront his own blind spots and assumptions. One evening, during a session led by a local community leader, James found himself listening to the story of a young black man who had been profiled multiple times in his own neighborhood. The man's voice was steady, but the pain beneath his words was unmistakable. James felt his chest tighten as he recognized the parallels between this man's story and his encounter with Marcus Bennett. After the session, James approached the man, his heart pounding. "Thank you for sharing your story," he said quietly. I've been on the wrong side of this, and I want you to know I'm working to be better." The man studied James for a moment before nodding. "It's a start," he said simply. Meanwhile, Marcus Bennett was making waves far beyond the precinct. His initiatives had sparked broader conversations across the city, drawing attention from local media and community leaders. Town hall meetings became a regular occurrence, providing a platform for residents to voice their concerns directly to law enforcement. At one such meeting, James stood silently at the back, listening as residents shared their experiences. He no longer felt defensive or dismissed their words as exaggerations. Instead, he felt a growing sense of responsibility. When one speaker called for more accountability within the department, James surprised himself by stepping forward. "I'm Officer Harper," he began, his voice steady but nervous. "And I want you to know that I hear you. I can't change the past, but I can promise you that I'm committed to being part of the solution." The room was silent for a moment, and then a smattering of applause broke out. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. The true test of James's transformation came one rainy afternoon. While on patrol, he and his partner, Officer Collins, responded to a call about a suspicious man loitering near a local park. When they arrived, James immediately recognized the man. It was the same young man who had shared his story during the training session. Collins, still skeptical of the changes within the department, approached the man with a hand hovering near his holster. "Sir, what are you doing here?" he asked, his tone sharp. James stepped forward, placing a hand on Collins's arm to lower the tension. "He's waiting for his sister," James said, recalling the man's earlier story about how he often met his younger sibling after school. The man nodded, visibly relieved. "She should be here any minute." James smiled. "No problem. We're just here to make sure everything's okay. Have a good day." As they walked back to the squad car, Collins shot James a sideways glance. "You've changed, Harper." James nodded. "Yeah, and maybe it's time you did too." Months later, the precinct felt like a different place. The changes Marcus had introduced were no longer seen as disruptions, but as necessary steps toward progress. Officers began to take pride in their work, not just for enforcing the law, but for building bridges with the community. Marcus, too, saw the fruits of his labor. During a ceremony at City Hall, he was presented with a Community Leadership Award for his efforts. As he accepted the plaque, he looked out at the audience and saw James sitting in the front row, clapping with genuine admiration. Later that evening, Marcus approached James. "You've come a long way," he said, "but the work never stops." James nodded. "I know, but thanks to you, I know where to start." The story of Marcus Bennett and James Harper is a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of deep-seated prejudice and systemic challenges. It takes courage to confront uncomfortable truths, humility to admit mistakes, and determination to forge a better path forward. For Marcus, his mission wasn't just about accountability, it was about hope. For James, it wasn't just about redemption, it was about becoming the kind of officer he had once aspired to be. Together, they proved that even the most unlikely encounters can lead to transformative change. This isn't just a story about a cop and a prosecutor. It's a story about humanity, growth, and the power of second chances.